Hello, I'm Senator Dick Durbin. Welcome to my Capitol Report, A Different View. On April 27, 1822, a man was born who later became one of the two presidents of the United States elected from our state of Illinois. His name, Ulysses S. Grant. And the monument to Ulysses S. Grant in Washington, D.C. is a statue that's become one of the most famous in our nation's capital. We'll visit it and tell you a little bit about the history of this famous monument. But first, this is another sad occasion. It is the 30th anniversary of the death of Dr. Martin Luther King, who died in April of 1968 by an assassin's bullet. A man we'll meet, one of my former colleagues in the House of Representatives, is from the 5th District of Georgia, Congressman John Lewis. John Lewis was a pioneer in the civil rights movement, a personal friend of Dr. Martin Luther King and the late Senator Robert Kennedy. When you hear John Lewis's story, you'll understand the courage that brought this man to prominence in our nation's history. When many Americans think of the most famous people serving in the U.S. House of Representatives, they of course know the leaders, and they know perhaps one of the members who's a member of the Baseball Hall of Fame, another who's in the National Football League Hall of Fame, and the late Sonny Bono, who was known worldwide as a rock star. One of my favorites is John Lewis, member of Congress from the 5th District in Georgia. His life is an amazing story, starting off on a farm in Alabama, eventually finding himself in the seminary in 1960 in Nashville, Tennessee. He became part of the civil rights movement, an important part of it. He was part of the sit-ins in 1960, even before he reached the age of 20. Then he was involved in the Freedom Bus rides. He was with Martin Luther King, standing in Washington, D.C. at the famous March on Washington and giving a speech that is still remembered. He was involved as well in the effort at Selma, the walk across the bridge that will forever be remembered. John was present at those moments in history, and he's here with us today. And I'm glad to be with you, John Lewis. How are you doing?
Well, thank you. I'm doing very well. I'm happy and pleased to be with you.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the stories that tells a lot about John Lewis is how you decided to become a preacher and how you used to practice your preaching when you were a young boy. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, growing up on that farm in rural Alabama during the 40s and the 50s, it was my responsibility to care for the chickens. And I fell in love with raising chicken. I felt like I could raise chickens like no one else could raise chickens. And I wanted to be a minister. I wanted to preach the gospel. So from time to time, as I would raise these chickens, I would gather all of my chickens together in the chicken house or in the chicken yard with the help of my brothers and sisters and my first cousin. And I would talk to these chickens. As a matter of fact, I would preach to them. And some would shake their head, some would bow their head. And I think about it sometimes, they never quite said amen.
So that was the beginning.
It was the beginning. And I saw these chickens as innocent creatures. And you know, Senator, when one would die or pass on, we would have a chicken funeral. And I would deliver the eulogy, and my sisters and brothers would serve as the mourners.
But you didn't stop in the chicken yard. You pursued your formal education and went on to become a preacher. And where did you study?
Well, I wanted to study to become a minister, so I enrolled at a little school in Nashville, Tennessee at the age of 17 in 1957. But at first I wanted to attend Troy State College. It is now known as Troy State University, and they didn't accept black students. So I wrote Martin Luther King Jr. a letter and told him of my desire to attend this little school. And so Dr. King wrote me back and suggested when I was home for spring break, this is about 40 years ago, to come by and see him. And he sent me a round-trip Greyhound bus ticket. And I will never, ever forget it. On a Saturday morning in March of 1958, I boarded this bus and traveled to Montgomery and met Dr. King for the first time.
And that was in 1958?
1958.
40 years ago.
I was 18 years old.
Oh, it had to be an inspiring meeting.
It was unbelievable. It was unreal. The time when I was ushered into the office of this church and met Dr. King, and he said, "Oh, you the boy from Troy? Are you John Lewis?" And I said, "Yes, I'm John Robert Lewis." I was so scared, so nervous. I told my whole name, but it was the beginning of a long and beautiful relationship with Dr. King.
You went on to school in Nashville.
I went on to school in Nashville and studied there for 6 years, studying religion and philosophy. But it was in Nashville that I got involved in the sit-ins and later the Freedom Rides. And it changed my life forever, really.
Now, the sit-ins themselves involved what? Was there a drugstore or a store downtown that would not serve blacks?
Well, there were several stores downtown. There was drugstores, the five and dime stores, variety stores, some of the chain stores, department stores that you can go in and buy clothing, you can buy paper and book and toothpaste, but you couldn't take a seat at a lunch counter. So a group of us, as young black and white students who have been taught the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence, we would go down, we would dress up, take our books, sit at the lunch counter all day long, and we wouldn't be served. And we would just sit there. And this went on for several weeks. And one day in late February of 1960, the local people made the decision to let the young opposition come in to beat us up. And they came in and started pulling us off the lunch counter stools, putting lighted cigarettes out in our hair, down our backs, pouring ketchup and water and hot water over us and started beating us. And we all were arrested. That became the first mass arrest in the sit-in movement.
How old were you, John?
I was 20 years old the first time I was arrested. And you know, I had been told growing up in rural Alabama, don't get in trouble with the law. Don't get arrested. Don't go to jail. You know, it's bad. It's a reflection on the name of on your family. And you didn't want to get arrested. You didn't want to go to jail. But I tell you, the first time I was arrested, it was liberating. It freed me, really. So jail became a way out, really.
How did your family react to the news that you were going to be actively involved in the civil rights movement, may be arrested, and may have your life threatened?
Well, my mother and father and grandparents and uncles, they didn't like it because they were afraid. They didn't know what might happen to me or to my family. When people read that this boy from rural Alabama up there in Nashville, hundreds of miles away, getting arrested and going to jail. So my mother wrote me a letter, said, you know, you're supposed to be getting an education. You should get out of this mess. That's what she said. And later they became very, very supportive and they understood.
You didn't get out of that mess, John. In fact, David Halberstrom has a new book called The Children that talks about you and I think 7 others who were involved in the civil rights movement. And from Nashville, you became involved in the Freedom Bus Rides. Tell us a little bit about what those were and how you played a role.
Well, during the latter part of 1960, the United States Supreme Court had issued an order banning segregation in the area of public transportation. And a group of us decided to test that decision. So we came to Washington, D.C. on May 1st, 1961. It was my first trip to Washington. By this time, I was 21 years old. Had all of my hair, and I was a few pounds lighter then. And we came here. It was 7 whites and 6 blacks to travel by Greyhound and Trailway from Washington through Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, on into the Deep South. And we arrived in Charlotte, North Carolina. A young black man went into the so-called white waiting room to get a shoe shine in the white barbershop. And he was arrested and taken to jail. The next day, the judge dropped the charges against him. And then my seatmate, a white gentleman, the 2 of us tried to enter a so-called white waiting room in Rock Hill, South Carolina, near Charlotte. We were attacked and beaten by a group of young white men and left lying in a pool of blood. And the riot continued to Anniston, Alabama, outside of Atlanta, between Birmingham and Atlanta. The bus was burned. And CORE, the organization that was sponsoring the Freedom Ride, decided to drop the ride. And some of us said, no, we cannot drop the ride. And Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, said there should be a cooling off period. It was too dangerous. We should stop riding in an integrated fashion through the South. And so we said no, and we decided to continue to ride.
Have you ever met any of these men who beat on you when you were part of the Freedom Bus Ride? Have you ever had a chance to cross paths again with them?
I've had a chance to visit some of the individuals, some of the elected officials. As a matter of fact, the governor of Alabama, Governor Wallace, I've had an opportunity to go and talk with him. The mayor Selma, who was mayor back in 19 64, 65, and he's still the mayor today. And these individuals said, we were wrong then. We call you an outside agitator. We call you a troublemaker. But today, when I go back to Alabama, whether it's Montgomery or to Selma or back to Troy, near where I grew up, they give me the key to the city. They have a parade for me. So it's really strange, really.
John, one of the pictures that you have here in your office, and there's so many, and I hope we can share them with the people who are in this program, shows a young John Lewis, and here you are at the Lincoln Memorial on that famous day when Dr. Martin Luther King gave his speech, the March on Washington, and I see several of these that are inscribed, and one of them says, we were there to hear John Lewis, because John Lewis was going to speak for young people in the civil rights movement.
Well, that picture there was me speaking at the March on Washington at the age of 23. As a matter of fact, the young man that took this picture is a graduate of the University of Chicago.
Oh, is that
His name
right?
is Danny Line, a great, unbelievable young photographer. He came south in 1962 with his camera, and he said, what can I do? What can I do? How can I be helpful? And he was a good photographer. And we said, use your camera, document what is going on. And this young graduate of the University of Chicago made unbelievable photographs of the struggle throughout the South.
You must have heard Dr. King speak many times, and I'm sure you've heard many public speakers. Did you have any idea on that day when he gave that speech how important that would be and how significant his words would be and be remembered for so long?
At the time, I didn't have any idea that I Have a Dream speech would be so meaningful and so significant. But he spoke from his whole soul, his whole being. He really poured it out. And I heard him on many, many occasions. But he was somewhat inspired, I think, and moved and lifted by the crowd when he looked out and saw that sea of humanity. I think he knew he had to do his best, and he did his best. And you had Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer, sitting back there saying, tell him about your dream, tell him about your dream. And you had others saying, make it plain. And they were it was almost like a church service, really. It was like a mass camp meeting right there on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial.
Now, there was another event that followed a little bit afterwards. It became kind of a signature event in the civil rights movement. And of course, that was the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. I was a college student in Georgetown here in Washington at the time and had planned to go down there and could not get away from work, and I deeply regret that I wasn't there. The man that I worked for in the Senate, Paul Douglas from Illinois, had his wife go down, Emily Taft Douglas, who was part of the march. But there in the front line, the two people who are noted on the cover of Life magazine, Dr. Martin Luther King and John Lewis, coming across that bridge. Tell me what you remember about that.
Well, I remember that very well, and I remember when Senator Douglas' wife came down. That meant so much. It meant so much to the movement. It meant so much to Dr. King, and I will never, ever forget that, really. You know, in Selma, Alabama at the time, it was very difficult, almost impossible, for the average person of color to be able to register to vote. Only 2.1% of black people of voting age were registered to vote in Selma and Dallas County, Alabama. There was a particular county in Alabama between Montgomery and Selma. This county was more than 80% African American. There was not a single registered African American voter in 1965. And people had been harassed, they had been beaten. And you had a mean sheriff there named Jim Clark. This guy wore a nightstick on one side, a gun on the other side, and he carried an electric cat prodder in his hand, and he didn't use it on cows. He used it on people. And we finally decided after many arrests and a great deal of violence, one man had been shot and killed in a little town near Selma, that we were going to march from Selma to Montgomery to dramatize to the nation that people wanted to register to vote. So on Sunday, March 7th, about 600 of us left a little church, started walking through the streets of Selma, came to the bridge, crossing the Alabama River, and we got to the apex of the bridge. We saw a sea of blue, Alabama state troopers. And we continued to walk. We came within hearing distance of the state troopers. And a man identified himself and said, I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is an unlawful march and it would not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and go back to your church. And we sent word back that we should kneel and pray. And before we can get word back, in less than a minute, this guy said, "Troopers, advance." And you saw these men putting on their gas masks. And they came toward us, beating us with nightsticks and bullwhips, and trampling us with horses, and using tear gas. That Sunday became known as Bloody Sunday. I was knocked down, and I had a concussion, and later I was hospitalized. But there was unbelievable reaction to what happened in Selma. A few days later, about 8 days later, President Johnson came before the Congress, spoke to a joint session of the Congress, and presented the Voting Rights Act. And it was in that speech, he said over and over again, "And we shall overcome." I was with Dr. King watching Lyndon Johnson speak that night, and tears came down his face, and he said, "John, we'll make it from Selma to Montgomery. The Voting Rights Act will be passed," and he was right.
John, the year 1968 was one that most of us of our age will never forget. I'm sure you won't. We're now the 30th anniversary of that year. There were 2 deaths that year that still, many of our lives' events will never measure up to those 2 events. Of course, the assassination of Robert Kennedy and the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. You were so close to Dr. King. Tell me how you felt and what your reaction was when you heard about his being killed.
When I heard that Dr. King had been assassinated, I was in Indiana, Indianapolis, campaigning with Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy was seeking the Democratic nomination for the presidency. And it was very dark. It was just a very dark and very sad hour for all of us. And Dr. King was my friend. He was my colleague on one hand, but he was my leader. He was my hero. I often think that if it hadn't been for Dr. King, I may be still down in rural Alabama preaching to those chickens, really. Because this man literally changed my life. And I think when Dr. King was assassinated, I think something died in all of us. I remember going to his funeral and being there in Atlanta at the Ebenezer Baptist Church. And then I sort of pulled myself together and said, well, we still have Robert Kennedy. And I literally threw myself in more than ever into the Kennedy campaign and went out to Oregon to campaign with him and then on to California.
You were in California, were you not, the night that he was assassinated?
I was in California, in Los Angeles, in Bobby Kennedy's room, the 5th floor of the Ambassador Hotel. Talked to him about 15 minutes before he went down to make his victory statement. And he was so up, and he said that evening that, we're going to win this thing. We're going to win it, but he sort of joked with me. He said, John, you let me down today. More Mexican American turn out to vote than Negroes. So he was sort of joking, saying we didn't do a good enough job to get more black folks out to vote for it. And he sort of suggested to us that we stay in the hotel, wait in this room till he returned. And watching him make his victory statement that evening by way of television, and a few minutes later saying that Robert Kennedy had been shot, it was too much.
John, I had some friends of mine who literally gave up on politics when he was assassinated.
Some of mine did also.
They said there was no hope, and the losses that had been sustained, Dr. King and Senator Robert Kennedy, that was it. They were finished with it. They lost all hope. You didn't lose hope. You stayed involved, and even today, serving, representing the 5th District in Georgia. Tell me, as you reflect a little bit on what you've been through in your life experience, tell me what keeps you going, what gives you hope that we can improve as a nation when it comes to race relations.
Well, you must have hope. But when you give up, when you lose hope, it is like not being here. It's like being dead. So it's very much in keeping with the philosophy and the discipline of the nonviolent movement to be hopeful, to have faith in the possibility, believing somehow and some way that you have the capacity, that you have the ability to overcome. And it's taking that great leap of faith. You don't have a blueprint, you don't have a roadmap, but you leap out there, you sort of put yourself in the way, believing that things going to change. And that's been my guiding philosophy. You know, it's going to be all right. Things are going to work out. There may be some setbacks, some disappointments, some interruptions here and there. But then if you take the long, hard look, somehow in some way, things going to work out. But we have to help things work out. We have to let, in my estimation, the spirit of history use us. I think that's what Martin Luther King Jr. did. I think that's what Robert Kennedy did.
And that's what John Lewis did. And I thank you for your contribution, not only to the U.S. House of Representatives. I count you as one of my friends and a person I admire very much. I thank you for what you've given to this country, and I look forward to serving with you for many years to come.
Well, thank you very much, Senator. You know, our country has one of my dear friends, and I really enjoy serving with you. You're a real statesman. Thank you.
Thank you, John. In the history of the United States, there have been two presidents elected from the state of Illinois. Abraham Lincoln, of course, and his commander-in-chief during the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant. Of course, Lincoln was born in Kentucky, Grant was born in Ohio, but they both ran for president from Illinois. Now, before I get cards and letters in my office, we know that Ronald Reagan was born in Illinois, but he was elected to the presidency from California. The two men we'll focus on today, and one in particular, are Lincoln and Grant. At one point in the Civil War, Lincoln had just about given up. He couldn't find a general who could win. And he looked to the west and found a man with a checkered career named Ulysses S. Grant, who'd been successful in the Western campaign. He brought him on as head of the Union forces. And of course, it led to victory and eventually the decision by Robert E. Lee and the Confederates to surrender. When you look at the mall today, you can see that relationship has been enshrined. On one end of the mall here in Washington, D.C., in 1922, we built the famous Lincoln Memorial, a tribute which most visitors find when they come to Washington to be one of the most inspiring. But here on the other end of the mall is a statue to Ulysses S. Grant, one that I think should be famous as well, not only because they worked so well together to preserve the Union and win the war, but because Ulysses S. Grant in his own right was a famous man in American history. I'm here today with Don Ritchie, who's the Assistant Senate Historian. Don, I'm glad you're with us again today.
Glad to be here.
And this is one of your favorite statues too, isn't it?
I think this is one of the most dramatic and moving statues in Washington. It's dramatic because of it doesn't glorify war, it shows the struggle and the agony of war. And it also doesn't necessarily glorify the man who's portrayed here. It tries to capture him very naturally.
Tell us about Ulysses S. Grant. I take it that he had kind of a checkered history before he became Commander-in-Chief.
You might say that he failed at everything before he became the great hero of the Civil War. He had gone to West Point very much against his will, and he'd graduated in the middle of his class. He was pretty well ignored by all the more dashing young officers like Robert E. Lee and so many of the others that he would fight against during the war. And he went out west, had some really miserable duty assignments, was lonely, missed his family, drank a little too heavily probably. Finally left the Army, got out, tried to find something to do, was a farmer for a little while, shopkeeper, postmaster, everything he could think of, until finally he swallowed his pride and went to work with his brother in Galena, Illinois, as a tanner. He didn't like the occupation, but it put food on the table. And he was there in 1861 when the war started, and he became a colonel in the 21st Illinois Volunteers, and that was the beginning of his rise to success in the war.
There's a famous story that when Grant was appointed head of the Union forces, there were his critics who said he just drank too much. And I think that Abraham Lincoln had a famous retort to that.
That's right. He said he wanted to know what he was drinking and he'd give it to the rest of his generals.
The interesting thing is you look around Washington, all the generals on horses, you find them in military uniform and they're all so starched and proper. And you look up here at Ulysses S. Grant and he looks like he's slouching and the clothes don't fit right. Was this kind of his image?
Grant was never concerned about his personal appearance. And he was also a man who was very calm in battle. He didn't panic. And this is a man sitting on a horse, sitting back, thinking, not worrying. I mean, probably he should have been smoking a cigar. That would have been his trade at that point. And some of the people who have looked at this sculpture have said that actually the horse looks more alert than the rider does. The horse's head is back, his ears are up, the horse is hearing the sound of the battle in the distance, and the rider is almost passive. but that was Grant's style, and I think Schrady researched that and he captured it very well.
So this famous and disheveled general that led us to victory in the Civil War then became President of the United States in 1869.
That's right. He became General of the Army in the 1860s during Johnson's administration, and then he was the front runner easily for the Republican nomination in 1868. There almost wasn't anything else for him to do, and he served 2 terms as president. They were not successful terms, however. He was a trained military man, but he wasn't a trained politician or executive, and he was a little too trusting of his advisors. There were many scandals during his administration, and it was not a great and glorious presidency by any means. And then he retired in 1868, traveled around the world, couldn't quite think of what to do, set up a stock brokerage company, went bankrupt, and then contracted a debilitating form of throat cancer and realized that he was dying and that his family would be impoverished. And he spent his last years writing his memoirs, which are a classic of American literature. He died before they were published, but they left his widow with a fortune and his family was able to live on.
Don, a lot of people, of course, look at the statue of General Grant on his horse and think that that is the major part of this work, but the 2 side statues that have been put together here are ones that I find just fascinating. I've been out here late at night and early in the morning, and I really think these are some of the most amazing sculptures in this town. Tell us a little bit about them.
Well, they really are. One is a statue of the cavalry, and on the other side is a statue of the artillery. The statue of the artillery is a gun wagon going through the mud, sort of sunken down into the mud. The reins are broken, the horses are uncontrollable. There's a look of despair on the faces of the soldiers. There's a sense of, it looks like it's cold and rainy while they're out there. This is not a glorification of war in any case. It's really capturing the reality of warfare. And on the cavalry side is a little more dynamic. It's a cavalry charge. The lead-off man has got his sword in the air, although the sword is gone, unfortunately. Now there's a trumpeter. But if you look, the first horseman the horse has stumbled, and the horseman has been thrown, and the horses behind are going to trample this horseman to death. And the sculptor, Henry Schrady, put his own face on the face of the fallen rider. And it was somewhat symbolic because he did give his life for the statue, and he died before it was dedicated. He also put some of the faces of his friends on the other riders, one of whom was the artist Maxfield Parrish. And if you look up, you can see a mustached man up there, and he's put in a sort of a little inside joke among for the sculptor to use well-known people from the time in this sketch. And then around the base of the statue are also some the foot soldiers. They're marching off into battle, and I think what he's tried to do here is show that it's not just the general of the army, it was the army that he was portraying in all of its dimensions, in cavalry and artillery and in foot soldiers.
Well, we honor Ulysses S. Grant's memory and, of course, commemorate his birthday, April 27th. The contribution he made to the United States, not only as the commanding general of the Union forces in the Civil War, but as President of the United States. And Don Ritchie, thank you for the tour.
Glad to be here.
I'm Senator Dick Durbin. I may see you on the steps of the U.S. Capitol near the Grant statue, back in Springfield, Illinois, or maybe in the city of Chicago. But I hope to see you next time for a Capitol Report, A Different View.